So join me in welcoming them to this morning's discussion. As Paulo said, the report really is intended to put a framework in place and to raise some questions, but it doesn't really answer every question. We put forward some ideas for consideration and some potential guidelines for how to think about what does deregulation mean, how can it be helpful, and what are the considerations that we need to have going forward. And so I think where we'd like to start is to just give each of our panelists just a short couple of minutes to reflect on what you've heard today, and then we'll launch into a couple of different questions. And I think what I'd like to do is to start with Steve. Having been in the role at the local level and being one who's known to push boundaries in significant ways, and would love to hear some general reflections, Steve, and any ideas you have that we need to pursue in conversation this morning.
Yeah, well, thanks, Susan, and thanks to our panelists for being here, and thanks for everybody taking time out of their busy schedules to do this. This is really important work, and I feel like in some sense there's a little symbiotic relationship here between the recommendations that found its way into the report and some of the things that we tried to do. I think first and foremost, as a district, part of what we tried to engage in was what was our theory of action. So what were we going to try to do? And I'm a simple guy, born in Northwest Ohio, kind of small town guy, so I try to reduce everything to its most simplest form. It's a very complex task that we're dealing with, but for me, it was about efficacy and making sure that those people who we entrusted to be closest to our kids had the authority and the responsibility to leverage time, tools, talent, and money in such a way to meet the needs of kids that they were meeting every single day. So it really was developing how, as a superintendent board, can we create conditions in our district to allow that to happen. And I shouldn't even say allow it to happen, to be purposeful about ensuring that it would happen. And then establishing and focusing on the what. That was kind of our role at the board and superintendent levels, establish those, kind of like the diagram that Paulo had up there about the state responsibilities and the local responsibilities. And that really was manifested at the district level. So we were kind of the state, assumed the state roles as it was articulated there. And then all the how was relegated to our buildings. And then we held them accountable for achieving the outcomes that we identified. And it was really as simple as that in terms of a governance structure, incredibly complex as we think about the delivery of how that occurred in our district.
Marc, I'd like to turn to you because I know that the notion of flexibility and accountability at the local level is a critical one. And as a board member, I'm sure you've run up against this either in frustration or in opportunity about what you can do as a board member, the power you have within the local structure and with the state regulations. What are your reflections on where we should be going here on some of this work?
Well, I think first we need to understand the problem. You get elected to a school board, right? Yippee, I win. You get elected to the school board, and the first thing that happens, sooner or later, somebody is going to pull you aside, and they're going to give you this book, which is Baker's, in my case, it was 2000-2001 Handbook of Ohio School Law. And they're going to say, that's the Bible, and it is forever changing. Every 3 months, you're going to get a document like this, which is from the Ohio School Boards Association. It's PDQ is Policy Development Quarterly, which is stuff that the legislature has done this quarter. And you'll have to create required policies around this. Somewhere along the line, you're going to see your local collective bargaining contracts with your teachers' unions, with your classified unions. These contracts in some cases were created years or decades ago with provisions that are so old that no current employee in the district has any idea how they got in there or why they got in there, but it's almost impossible in some cases to bargain them out. So you have those restrictions. And then of course every 2 years we have the state biennial budget process where all kinds of new and interesting education regulation provisions get in. This year alone, for example, in the first 6 months, some part of the budget, some not, we see proposals to require cursive writing in our schools. We see proposals to change graduation requirements, although we see those virtually every year. We see proposals to, especially this year, limit the lengths of tests, even local tests, and on and on and on. So from my perspective, local districts are on this really endless treadmill of trying to comply with regulation. In the last couple of years, we've seen mandatory teacher evaluation systems, principal evaluation systems. Really, the list is endless. So you wind up spending virtually all of your time complying with either local collective bargaining agreements or state and federal regulations, and less time doing what your constituents want you to do.
So if that's the experience at the local governance and the local operational level, Tom, you spend a lot of your time working both with superintendents and with the relationship that superintendents have with statute as well as with the Department of Education. So how do you and your members think about this question and recommendations in the report?
Well, it's kind of interesting. As I reflected on the report when I read it, there's one other element. Districts have an unfortunate habit of over-regulating themselves. Mark has mentioned the collective bargaining agreement, but basically a school district is governed by policy, which is the responsibility of the board. In many instances, state law will require a given policy. But by the same token, how detailed the policy is leads to additional regulation. I had a board member, I served as a superintendent for 21 years, and one of those districts for 15 and a half years, I had a very wise board member who used to say, the more you define something, the more you limit it. And I think that there's a kernel of truth to that. And for that reason, I think that sometimes boards, districts, either through policy or through administrative rules, over-regulate themselves and tie the hands of teachers in the classroom who are trying to be more flexible. And so it's not just what the state does, okay, whether it be the state board or whether it be legislators, it's also what districts do to themselves. And sometimes I think that we need to keep our eyes open more to the opportunities than for that flexibility. One other thing I might say, just for those of us who've been around since the earth started to cool and can look back 40 years ago at what the state standards were, and we look at these things now, we talk about regulation. 40 years ago, the state standards in the state of Ohio actually prescribed the amount of time spent for reading instruction, for math instruction, I mean, social studies, I mean, the minutes per day, per week actually, were actually defined in state rules. So while we still have a long way to go in terms of flexibility, particularly in the interests of students and their success, we need to remember where we also were, and we have come some ways.
Good to keep in mind. Todd, as we think about the role that you're playing at the state level, and we think about the notion of statutes, administrative rules, policy at the state level, policy at the local level, do you buy this argument that the state role should be much more limited? And if so, what does that look like? What are your responses to that notion, and what role might the state board play in that?
Well, the broad areas that Paulo outlined are actually something that some board members have discussed with each other as to what is the role of regulation. In fact, it was crystallized during the discussion of the revision to the state operating standards just a few months ago. And what is the role of the state dictating staffing patterns, for example? And there was broad agreement that that's outside of it. That agreement, though, is not as deep as it appears, and it's not just with state policymakers. I think it's with locals. To give you an example, I was privy to some of the requests for how the excellent districts should have their regulations and requirements waived in a voluntary process. And you know what the first thing a lot of them were asking for waiving? Accountability measures. They didn't want to do assessments. They didn't want to be responsible for a third grade reading guarantee. They didn't want to be accountable. I mean, that's the first thing they wanted to get out from under, not not these other things. And frankly, the time I've spent in the state board has made a couple other truths apparent to me. One is some people want to be regulated, and I'll use the debate over the 5 of 8 rule again. The number of times we had a superintendent come in and tell the board, we think it's important that you tell us that we have this staffing pattern because music and art and nursing and these things are important. I said, wait a minute, you're the superintendent. Would you like me to dictate other things about how you run your district and what staffing pattern you have? I have some personal views I'd like to impose on you if you're willing. No, but these are important. And that plays itself out over and over again when I talk to superintendents and board members and candidly legislators who, these things are important to deregulate except for my particular cause. I'll point out, I think, and this makes it a little more difficult, but Paulo's model of 3 areas for state responsibility, I think, leaves out one that is a necessary responsibility, at least so long as we choose to take federal money. And that is prescriptions dictated by the federal government, which tend to be around, it's generally, though not exclusively, a rights-based model. And secondly, it's somewhat narrow in what the requirements are, but they're exceedingly prescriptive in how they do it. You want to build new athletic facilities, and you're thinking about differences in the locker rooms for your boys and girls, even though the boys' football team tends to be larger and you need more facilities. You better be very cautious how you go about that for compliance with Title IX. If you want to change the process for development of an IEP, you better be very careful as to how you go about doing that in violation of ADA. I'll go back to the last comment is about one of the recommendations. And while I think the idea of waivers is an admirable one, I think one of the things that is going to ensure that this process takes a long time to ever come to real fruition and I'm talking Tom Ash description of what time frames are. I mean, 20 years is a confidence that waivers are going to continue. Why have a waiver process? Why enter into a waiver process if you as a superintendent, and I understand this absolutely, if you think the next political regime is just going to wipe it away or change the rules substantially, and you won't be able to continue whatever the good idea was that you started with, so why waste my effort on something that I don't know is going to be there in 3 years when I can work within the limits of what I have to do what I think can be there.
Thank you all. I want to skip really quickly to a targeted question for you, and that is, from your perspective, what are the most meaningful, rich, and what are the most meaningful and rich targets for considering deregulation? What rules or what statutes? And why? Who'd like to start that? And it may be something that we mentioned, it may be something completely outside of what was in the report.
All right, I'll take a crack at that. I am a creature of the private sector. So getting elected to a school board and learning all about public policy was somewhat new to me. And one of the things that surprised me the most is the inability to use compensation for strategic purposes. In other words, strategic compensation. In the public sector, at least public sector and education, market forces do not apply. And I think that they should. For example, if I need to hire a high school physics teacher, high school physics teachers are in relatively short supply. I cannot, according to my local collective bargaining agreement, pay somebody enough to be a high school physics teacher as opposed to the other career options that they might have. On the other hand, we have a glut in Ohio of K-3 teachers, but I would need to pay them exactly the same as I would pay for the high school physics teacher. I also don't have a meaningful ability to define a career ladder for employees that don't necessarily lead to administration. So if I am a master teacher, the only way up is through the administrative ranks. Well, being an administrator and being a teacher are two entirely different skill sets. You can be really, really good at one and really, really bad at the other, and yet I don't have a way to meaningfully promote my master teachers, give them more autonomy, give them more flexibility, give them more authority, and yes, give them more compensation without promoting them into a job that they may be entirely unqualified for. So if I had one thing that I can change, it would be the ability to use strategic compensation. Compensation not only in the form of pay and benefits, but compensation in the form of flexibility and autonomy.
Thanks, Mark.
I think that one thing that we need to do in this state is take a comprehensive look at the whole licensure issue. It has to do with not just the license itself, but also with preparation. Sometimes we become overly prescriptive in terms of what it is that people are licensed to teach. And I think that administrators pay attention to that because we also have high-quality teachers under federal law. We have all of those issues. But I think that we need to have a comprehensive conversation about the whole licensure process. And I think we need to have a renewed conversation on the induction process for new teachers. We tend to lose a lot of teachers in the first few years of their careers. And I think that, and I look at, for example, the career tech area. Just an anecdotal story. This past year, a superintendent of a career tech was complaining basically that she was going to lose a very high-quality welding instructor from her program because the teacher in the process of the induction process provided by the state and in the process of taking the courses necessary to renew a license, had basically said, look, I left a very promising and thriving welding business to come here to teach because I thought, oh, this is going to be pretty good. I'll get 2 or 3 months off every summer, and so I'm taking a little cut in pay. This is going to be just fine. And before that person finished the first year, said, I'm not coming back. I'm working more hours teaching and preparing myself to teach next year than what I was working in the private sector for less money. So I think we need to look at that whole induction process as well as the licensure issue.
Great. We have just a couple minutes, so I want to make sure that Steve and Todd have an opportunity that we can offer an opportunity for questions.
I'll only echo the issue of pay and ability to recruit. I'm reminded of an anecdote where I spoke to a teacher dean at a very large public college school of education who, when I suggested in a speech that there is a problem with many districts not being able to find math and science teachers, and the person responded, I just graduated a whole group and they can't find jobs. And I said, yes, it's because they want to go, they live in Westerville and Hilliard and they want to stay there. They don't want to move to Astoria. And one of the ways you can do that is through compensation. But I'll take that a step further. I think pension reform is important. I think having a public pension system as the only defined option creates perverse incentives, particularly among longer-serving teachers, that encourages them to stay in a job that they no longer enjoy and which, based on seniority rules, they're not likely to get removed from. When, if there were opportunities for them to look at other jobs that wouldn't jeopardize their ability to utilize the pension benefits they've earned, or for young teachers to come in and work 10 years and not get proportionally ripped off for their contribution unless they stay another 10 or 15 years, that would be helpful. But that is a huge nut to crack. It is a very complex thing to do, especially in a state with, as we saw in the last week in news reports, continually underfunded pension systems. But that's what, if I had a magic wand, I would seek to change it.
Thanks. Yeah, I would follow up on some of the conversations that have already been articulated and really focus on, I really like recommendation number 2 that you put in place. We went through some financial challenges in our district shortly after passing a bond issue to build buildings. We then had to pass an operating levy, and we had difficulty doing that. And so we ended up having to reduce staff en masse, teaching, non-teaching, and administrative staff, almost $15 million over 2 years out of a $55 million budget. We had to figure out how to get creative to provide opportunities for our kids that they were going to lose in otherwise traditional delivery modalities. And so we ended up partnering with a whole lot of folks. And I always use the phrase, we didn't innovate just to innovate. We innovated to get results. And until we could find that holy grail for every kid, we were going to find creative ways to do it. But we were able to partner with a lot of not only public entities, but private entities to provide opportunities for our kids. Our first relationship was with Columbus State. We actually had Columbus State adjunct professors come in and teach at that time before College Credit Plus. Thank you for the College Credit Plus. We provided college teachers teaching high school courses, but we ran into credential issues. They're licensed to teach college, but they can't theoretically teach high school. And we use Credit Flex, and again, thanks for Credit Flex, to engage in some of those. We partnered with Ballet Met, who provided a teacher for us to deliver Pilates and yoga. We traded space in our building for that. We partnered with a Latchkey group to provide music education opportunities to our kids. We hired paraprofessionals to do rigorous physical activity opportunities for our kids in lieu of some physical education. We had master teachers come in. We had parapros match with them. So we found all kinds of ways to utilize resources outside of the school district to come in and provide opportunities for kids, really rigorous opportunities for kids that we ended up providing actually more opportunities for our kids under those scenarios than we did before, at much less the cost. And so anything that drives up the cost, which is some of the things that are articulated in the report, is a really important thing. And the last thing I would say, also, I like to think about how we define the school day, the school year in an age of technology and digital learning. I think there's some opportunity spaces there. And finally, I would support the fourth recommendation. Rather than having this kind of piecemeal thing happen every 2 years according to budget cycles and other kinds of things, having a commission of sorts to come together to think about how we can create kind of a clearinghouse approach to some of these things, I think makes infinite sense for a lot of folks in the trenches.
Thank you very much. And I would wonder if there's any questions in the audience. We'd be happy to take 1 or 2 questions.
Don't be shy.
Heard the question about the promise of a thorough and efficient system of common schools, because that phrase in the DeRolf decision has been ignored by the legislature. Basically, what has happened is that the funding is basically a local funding. And you can talk about all the deregulation you want, but in the end, it becomes a political system, a political question at the local level. And when you talk about the changes in the teachers' contracts, I agree with Marc. Teachers have no career unless you're able to move them up beyond, and it was 14 years when I was on the board. Now in Worthington, it's 30 years. But the question is that all these things are negotiated politically at the local level. And as long as you have this system where you have a levy every 3 years, where you have to hear that the bond issues fail. In my career, we failed 3 bond issues and 2 levies. But those are the things that that militate against changes, against deregulation, because the fundamental thing is a local problem of funding. Thank you.
So would someone like to respond to that tension between the very strong resolve that would be needed at the local level as deregulation were to happen, and the tension that that creates in making sure that deregulation remains real? Or is that just a fundamental part of the local control situation of listening to and responding to constituents?
Well, I'll take a crack at that. I think when you take a look at the funding issue and you look nationwide, there's only one state in the country that doesn't have a local share, and that's Hawaii, because it's a single district. There's only one school district in the entire state. I think that, you know, if you're going to talk about local control, then you have to talk about a local share. And of course, the tension for that becomes what is the appropriate amount of the local share as opposed to the state share, and I understand that. But I also think that if you're going to look at flexibility, and you're going to look at deregulation at the local level, and particularly I like to think of deregulation at the classroom level, because that's where I think it is most effective. Because I think that then good teachers can use the data they have to inform the instruction that is student-centered. And I think that's what becomes critical with flexibility. But you're never going to have flexibility at the local level if you don't have some buy-in. And so, again, there's that tension between what is the appropriate share, state, local, federal. There is that tension, I recognize that, but I also recognize that you're not going to have local flexibility if you don't have a local buy-in.
Thanks, Tom. And I know that we're out of time for this morning, so I want to make sure, unless we have one more question. Do you have one more question? Yes, please. One more, and then we'll wrap it up.
All right, great. My name's Eric Brown, and you know, I'm understanding the concept of deregulation that you're talking about here, and wanting to provide as much flexibility to local school boards as possible, and in many ways that makes sense to me. But I'm not sure I understand, with respect to the collective bargaining and wanting to take away the local authority of school boards to bargain certain issues, removing the ability of boards to negotiate with respect to those things deemed management rights. It seems irreconcilable with the notion of providing greater flexibility to local school boards. So I don't know which of you may want to address that, but I'm just trying to understand, because those seem irreconcilable to me. Thank you.
I'll respond. I actually, in looking at the report, I'm not as tied to the idea of removing those rights, though I understand the motivation. The motivation derives from the fact that a hyper-local elective system creates the motivation for those who have the most at stake in an election, and that would be teachers, their family and friends, and staff and their family and friends, to participate in the election. And when you have elections for school board that are upwards of 15 and 20% of the voting population on off cycles, it tends to distort what would be probably the broader popular will. But that's a truth, and that's just the way democracy works. You show up, your voice counts. You don't show up, it doesn't. I'm actually not as concerned about, I don't put as much stock into that recommendation as a chief solution. However, the ability of the state or a higher authority, such, you know, if you theoretically gave collective bargaining power at the building level, for example, to override those provisions based on the abject failure of a district to educate its students, I'd be greatly in favor of that. If we had a system where a state with a persistently failing district was able to wipe out the collective bargaining agreement and reconstitute it because after so many years the district is still not working, I'd be open to that.
Great. And I think that will, yeah, Mark, yeah, one more word.
The negotiated agreement between Columbus City Schools and the Columbus Education Association weighs in at something like 250 pages. In fact, it's so large that they sold advertising in the middle of it to offset the printing costs. If you peruse through the 250 pages, I would dare say that there is not one of those pages that is more concerned with the rights of the children in the district versus the adults in the district. So long as you have that kind of balance in your collective bargaining agreement, there'll always be a need for, from a management perspective, deregulation from that agreement.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you to all of you who are with us here today. Thanks to the panelists who shared your thinking. We do want to be able to make sure that whatever happens going forward in terms of deregulation does keep the interests and the achievement and the welfare of our students in mind, primarily in Ohio, because we have so much work to do together. So thank you very much.